Tracy K. Smith is a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, memoirist, editor, translator, and librettist. She served as the 22nd Poet Laureate of the United States from 2017 to 2019, during which time she spearheaded American Conversations, celebrating poetry in rural communities with the Library of Congress, created the American public media podcast The Slowdown, and edited the anthology American Journal 50 Poems for Our Time.
She is a Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets and an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society. She is the Boylston Professor of Oratory and Rhetoric at Harvard University and a Susan S. and Kenneth L. Wallach Professor at Harvard Radcliffe Institute. Welcome to the first 50 pages, Tracy.
Thank you so much.
You have a new book coming out in November called Fear Less, Poetry in Perilous Times. Can we start by talking about what this book is and how it came to be for you?
Oh, absolutely. It's a book that explores the joys of reading poetry and in many ways seeks to help dissuade people of a common fear of the art form that many people have. They've picked it up maybe from taking tests in school about poems or being asked questions that make poems seem like riddles or like puzzles that are trying to get the best of the reader. And it's also a book that is really thinking specifically about the relevance of poetry to this age of polarization that we live in. And what I mean by that is poetry is an art form that instills in us a reverence for strangers and reminds us that there is some small piece of another person's story that can often illuminate facets of our own stories or our own feelings that we haven't even necessarily brought language to. And to me, this feels like a way of building back a sense of community across all manner of distance. And that feels like an urgent need at this moment, not only in America, but certainly in America.
In the very beginning of this book, you say that throughout your reading life, poems have greeted you with what feels like urgent compassion. Can you talk a little bit about what that urgent compassion means to you?
Sometimes I think about the experience of reading a poem like reading a letter. Like someone has poured their heart out to you and given you just the unfiltered version of what's real for them, even if it's somebody that you've never met before. And in moments of my life, like moments where loss hit me, the death of my mother when I was in my 20s, or the rupture of a relationship that felt like it was the world, poems have consoled me by bringing me close to another person's version of their own experience of loss. But it's not just those major upheavals. Poetry has helped me realize that even though in real time and day-to-day life, it's sometimes hard to come up with the best questions or to bring the best language to what you're thinking or what you're needing, poetry is a way of slowing down and moving toward those really complex sites of feeling and asking the right questions and paying a different kind of attention. And when you look up from the page, some of that wherewithal stays with you. And so I think that it's a fortifying art form. It's an art form that's filled with life skills, not just beautiful literary gestures.
Yeah, and when I was reading the book, and I kind of flip between fearless and fearless. Like, I love that, the play on words of the title. It just is fantastic. But
Thanks.
In reading the book, I really feel like you are rooting for readers, right?
Yeah.
You're rooting for us to find the joy in poetry, and you are giving us tools to do that in a very accessible way. So I am no scholar of poetry. I took one poetry class in college, but I am a reader and a lover of words and a believer in the power of language. And after reading this book, I really feel I have been changed in how I will look at and think about poetry going forward. One of the insights that hooked me right away was that you don't always have to understand poetry. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's the question that really clenches people as readers. What is this about, and what does this mean? Because it's asking us to reduce a series of feelings, statements, and also the memories and associations that are triggered for us as readers to a message. And I really don't think that's where poems come from or what they're pointed at. And so what I try and remind readers is sometimes the sounds of words, sometimes the cumulative effect of images takes you somewhere. And that's an effect of the poem that you can revel in and that you can be sure of. And you can also trust that at the next time you read the poem, perhaps those very same effects will take you elsewhere because you are going to be, slightly different at that moment in time from where you are now. And so to open up this sense of freedom of approach, a sense of maybe even like a vaster scale upon which we can imagine poems to operate, not just the cognitive or logic-based parts of our brain that we use a lot, but I don't even think it's the biggest part of our mind. Mm-hmm. And poems allow us to move toward, sites of feeling, sites of association, what I think of as an inner knowing that often defies terms of logic and even transcends what would be logical for us based on the extent of our lived experience. But I think we're bigger than all of that. And poems seep into all of these different facets of our large and mysterious selves.
Somewhere in the book, and other things you've done too, you talk about how a poem can take on different feelings and meanings if you come back to it later.
I think it's so true because we change so much. Yeah. Mm-hmm. We have new experiences to call back to. I was in Wyoming years ago when I was doing the Poet Laureateship, and there was a reader in the audience, an older man who kind of like described himself as somebody who doesn't really know that much about poetry and, maybe is even a little bit skeptical of the art form. But we were sitting together in this room of strangers to me, reading poems aloud and just saying what we noticed, what gestures or even language in poems caused us to remember from our own lives and from our own experiences. And he sort of like bolted up in his seat and he said, I get it. When you're reading a poem, you're just kind of pouring this thing in through your own filter. And your filter picks up on certain details, and my filter is going to get different details from you because I've had a different life than you. And I bet the next time you read the poem, your filter's changed. And I thought that was just like such a beautiful response. First of all, he crafted a really useful metaphor for thinking about this art form. Yeah. And he pulled it to a place that made poems feel like what they are, which is practical. They're practical tools for thinking about what it feels like to be alive now and what it has felt like at other moments in our life.
And I feel like his story kind of makes poetry feel more accessible. I mean, obviously your whole book does, and how you break everything down. And
I think that's what poems are for. I think that's what they emerged from, the need to be able to be met where you are, as you are, by an affirmation that others have been there too, and that it's been similar and different for them. It's a way of telling the story of humanity. And all of the different registers that spans.
Yeah. So my next question is a bit tongue-in-cheek, but what is the right way to read poetry?
Well, one of the first things I like to say is there is no one way to read a poem. Poems come from the singular experience of, people across time and space. And every single version of consciousness has its own way of approaching, something like a poem, and they all are useful. For readers of this book who have poetry anxiety, my suggestion is to think of the poem as a conversation, a voice, a stranger coming up to you and saying, hey, come here. let me just tell you what it was like. And to listen, to see what that voice is saying, go to the place and the space and in your imagination where this story or this realization seems to be taking place. And also to allow your own memories, questions, and associations to bubble up and be useful to what you're taking in. I like to also encourage people to read poems out loud because you hear the music of language more directly. There's also something really interesting about the pronouns that poems ask you to say. So if the speaker of a poem is telling you their story, they're going to say I or we. And to voice that yourself, I believe it puts you that much more firmly in the context and the headspace that the poem emerges from. And sometimes that's assuring, reassuring, and sometimes it's unsettling in a useful way. What I'm really rooting for, I love my art form. I feel like it has saved my life many, many times. But I'm not just rooting for poetry, I'm rooting for us. I'm rooting for people in the 21st century where a lot of walls have come up between us and others, us and our environment, and us and ourselves. And I think that poetry helps us realize that there's something that we might choose to move courageously closer to, even when it takes us out of habit or out of the comfort of the predictable. And I really do believe that that's not just about becoming good readers or, imaginers, but also humans and citizens. We need to find a way to move willingly and earnestly in good faith toward people that we don't yet know and people whose stories are different from our own.
I just want to say this morning, as I was, waiting to come in today, I was like, oh, I have a few minutes. I'm going to listen to, you did a talk for the Harvard Divinity School, and you were reading poetry by Ely, and the one that you read, Between Strangers, I rewound and listened to that one over and over again because it just really hit me, in this moment that we're in.
Yeah, I was like, talk about crossing borders toward others. That poem is a book that I co-translated with someone named Chang Tai-bi, of a 20th and 21st century Chinese poet named Ely. And so to inhabit her imagination, her conscience, and also regions of her culture, it was beautiful. It became useful for me when I came back into myself and came back into, my position as an American in quite interesting times to see this sense of self, this sense of fearlessness toward strangers, and this sense of an embracing of a kind of freedom from somebody who's writing about another place and other political circumstances.
Yeah. Back in 2017, you were appointed Poet Laureate of the United States by former Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden. Then, as now, the narrative is that we're living in a time of division and uncertainty and fear. And part of your work as Poet Laureate was going out into rural communities to push back against the narrative of America as a divided nation. Can you talk about your American Conversations project and what you really took away from your work on this?
I smile because I have reflected on that tour so much in the years since I left the laureateship. Initially during the pandemic, when none of us were doing much traveling or much engaging. But American Conversations was a project that brought poetry programming via me and an anthology called American Journal that I would share courtesy of the Library of Congress with everybody in the audience at these events. And we would just, even if we were in a library, even if we were in a community center or a large theater, we would do the same thing, which was to read poems aloud a few times and then to have a conversation about what people noticed, remembered, wondered, and felt in response to the poems. And the project took place in rural communities for two reasons. One, as a poet, I'm often traveling to cities for literary festivals or to university towns. But there's a whole other segment of America that I was eager to visit and to bring literary programming where it doesn't always happen. I didn't grow up in a rural community, but I grew up in the kind of town where we didn't get big readings. I never met a living writer until I left home for college. But the other reason is grounded in that sense of polarization. So I started as Poet Laureate in 2017, and in my memory, that was the beginning of a new vocabulary that we took on as Americans. And it was a vocabulary of adrenalized debate, dismissal, belittlement, and a vocabulary of let me clap back at this person who holds a different perspective, and let me double down on what I know from my gut. And I think we see that we're far deeper into that perspective. But I kept thinking that's how we're encouraged to behave in a lot of contexts, when we're debating our political opinions, or even when we're shopping online and we want to rate or rank the products. Mm-hmm. But poetry really encourages us to be gentle toward another voice and perspective, and to seek to trust it as far as we can, and to open ourselves up to a kind of vulnerability and a kind of wonder. And I kept thinking, if only we could talk about our lives outside of the framework of debate and aided by what poetry encourages us to remember. And so when I got the call from Dr. Hayden, I said, this is exactly what I want to do. I want to test out my theory that we can feed each other and learn to love aspects of each other if we just adopt this other mode of discourse. There was one instance in a space in Kentucky. It was a rehab facility for men, and it was a kind of rehab facility where you're mandated by the court to be a resident there. It wasn't about choice. And we walked into the space, and there was one of the Library of Congress staff members said, I recognize a tattoo on that particular person that gives me pause. Mm-hmm. It seems to align with kind of white nationalist stance. Are you comfortable being in this space as a Black woman? Yeah. And I said, we're here to do this thing. Let's just go in and do it in good faith. Let's see what happens. And that particular man had the most vulnerable, beautiful, and illuminating reading of a poem about heartbreak. And he said, I know this is a love poem. I know this is about a breakup, but it really gives me access to my own relationship to substance. And that's where it's hitting me right now. And it just brought a huge realization to me that, let's not judge, let's not fear one another off the bat, but also we can unfold these regions, these pockets of ourselves, if we wish to, and it can be healing to others.
I feel like there is, this longing that we don't really talk about, but for connection. And this project, what an incredible thing to be able to do. But I think still we're in a space in time where we all long for connection with other people. And how incredible that poetry can be that tool, to provide us connections.
Yeah.
One of the other things that you talk about too, so not only the sense of community and connection, but the poets teach us to ask questions, to struggle. And I tried to pay attention, kind of to this sort of idea that poetry will challenge us, that it's sometimes discomforting, startling. These are words that you use throughout the book. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. There's so much that has been rewarded in each of our lives for seeming mastery and certainty. And in some ways, it's like a habit that we have to spout what we know, to fudge and make it seem like we know what we don't know. And I think it's exhausting. I also think that it prevents us from growing in a lot of ways. And to be willing to say, I didn't quite get that. Or, that's interesting, I don't know that, tell me more, is such, it feels like a much healthier and promising stance. And you're right, I think poems bring you there, because even when they're ostensibly about an experience that you've had, there's inevitably some facet of this other person's take on it that pulls you out of what you remember and towards something that you might be able to affirm, say, oh, right, I didn't realize it was like that, but that's a great way of putting it. Or leading you down a path that's startling, and that's useful for the fact of reminding you of how wide the range of experience actually is. I like, and I think this is maybe a weird thing to say, I like feeling small. I didn't always. Like, I came to poetry when I was in my late teens. I was far from home, and I did feel small on this college campus, feeling like, oh, I don't know as much as everybody else. I don't feel as cool as everybody else. I'm sort of confused. And then poems open up all of these spaces that you fill, even with someone else's wisdom, and that teach you how to build your own wisdom. But I don't think that makes you feel big in the world. I think it gives you a sense of awe and a desire to move more and more willingly toward the largeness that we haven't mastered, but that we know is rich and near. And I just think that is a human stance that we've raced away from in our anxiety to excel, to achieve, and to climb up all the many different types of social ladders that we submit to in this moment in human culture.
So prepping for our conversation has been this super wonderful, kind of enlightening journey for myself, rediscovering oh, I do like poetry, because we just put up these preconceived notions of that's not a genre I gravitate towards, or, probably based out of fear of I'm not good at that. But really and truly in this book, you've given readers a gift to feel like we can truly embrace the art form of poetry without worrying that we're doing it wrong. Because as a self-proclaimed recovering perfectionist, that can be a hard thing to do. But what a joy to take time to listen to poetry being read aloud and to seek out poetry and to ask more questions. And one of the things that I discovered while prepping for our conversation here is the podcast that you started with American Public Media in partnership with the Poetry Foundation, The Slowdown. Could you tell us a little bit more about The Slowdown?
Oh, yeah. That was in many ways an extension of American Conversations. I felt so fortunate to be able to be traveling to all of these different spaces and communities and meeting such wonderful people and talking about poetry. And I just wanted to be able to invite others to imagine doing a similar thing. And so the podcast sort of emerged from that wish. Of course, it's different, though. It's one voice, 5 minutes. And so I said, well, every day I'll share a poem by a different poet but I will preface it with a reflection or a story or something that opens up a space within the reader's heart, or the listener's heart, for the poem to land. Maybe bringing us towards some of the context that the poem is going to address, or maybe just reflecting on something that seems analogous. And it was a real gift to be able to do that, discover the work of far more poets than I had initially been aware of. And then when I let go of that project as something I was doing every day, Ada Limon, who became the 24th Poet Laureate of the United States, became the host. And then Major Jackson became the host, and now Maggie Smith is the host. So there's like a beautiful lineage of poets with really different voices and perspectives, but that are kind of what I think of as carrying this gift forward.
And I feel like that is something, I don't know if it's unique to poetry, but something that's really beautiful about poetry is the community of poets, the connection of poets really across time, across culture, the connection of thoughts and the expansion of that. I think that's a really beautiful aspect of poetry that I didn't really think about until reading your book.
Yeah, we learn. I mean, most writers learn from other poets or other writers.
Yeah.
And so those are close bonds that defy, culture, language, time period, even the border between life and death. And it's I don't really know what to say. It's like the lineage of language, the lineage of an art form that asks us to look inward and to claim the use and the power of every single thing, large or small. And when I first started reading poetry, I used to like to say, well, okay, I'm reading this poet. Who should I read next? Well, let's see, who has this poet read? Who do they reference in their work? Who have they learned from? And then moving sort of backward through the literary continuum, temperament by temperament. That was a really wonderful way of expanding my knowledge of the art form. And it's a small world when you think about poetry in this moment or in this country, but it defies all of those boundaries and others as well. So I feel myself to be holding hands right now with the poet Rumi from the 13th century, because his poems have been so useful to me during, this time of great consternation, to realize that devotion and that a kind of willful sense of play, sense of storytelling, and sense of a roving imagination can be fortifying, has been really, really heart and mind stabilizing for me over these last seasons.
So yeah, have I said this already? I really love this book. And 6 chapters. It's a fast. It's a read that you want to take time with. Even though it's a short book, it's definitely one that I will want to purchase and underline and highlight and revisit, and all of these. Like I said, so many moments of insight. But the chapter that's going to stay with me the longest, just in memory, is the 3rd chapter. Any small thing can save you. And if I can, in this chapter, you write, fear degrades our ability to do anything in the face of what threatens us. Fear stuns, blurs out our options, convinces us it is better to fall silent and still, to consent, to go along and trust that eventually everything will feel normal again. At its most dangerous, fear keeps us from facing or even fully contemplating what, for our own survival, we must endeavor to change. Like, I scribbled that note furiously as I was reading through that and stopped to have to think about what that means to me. And it's kind of scary and daunting, but you do give us hope in the answer of poetry through that. And so that's just my take. But for you, what do you hope that readers are going to take with them in reading Fearless, Poetry in Perilous Times?
Well, a lot of things.
Yeah.
One thing that that's really on my mind, maybe because I'm back in the classroom right now as an educator, is the rewards of struggle. I am not saying that poetry is simple, swift, easy, and pat. But I'm saying that if you allow yourself to respond in all the different ways that arise and to process them, some of which are going to be exciting and joyful, and some of which will be challenging, not because necessarily the language of the poem or the references of the poem that you're reading are hard, but because they activate your awareness of that which is hard in your life or in the world. And I feel like being more and more willing to confront the difficult and to approach it as something that we're equipped to move toward and to move through is a huge wish that I have right now, because there's so much that's being produced, by the minute to make everything easier for us.
Yeah.
And to take away a lot of the beautiful powers that we have. And one is the power of discernment. One is the power of, courage to say, you know what, I don't always see eye to eye with that person, but I'm not afraid to move toward them in trust. These are capacities that we could quickly lose if we get lulled by the conveniences that are flooding us day and night. And so, yes, I love the literary tools of metaphor. I love rhyme. I love, alliteration. I love the ways that poets play with form. But again, what they're building in us are durable life skills and things that can make our lives richer and fuller, are always what I'm hoping we can choose to turn toward.
Yeah, perfect. That's wonderful.
Thank you so much, Tracy, for the incredible and inspiring conversation today. We know that readers are going to find so much to appreciate in Fear Less: Poetry in Perilous Times, which publishes November 18th.
But of course, while you're waiting for this amazing book, you should definitely seek out poetry. You can find brilliant classic and contemporary poets in the 800s at your local library, or subscribe to the Slowdown podcast. Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Loved our conversation.
Yeah, such an honor.